Hope Hicks is back in the news. The one-time model who started in PR for Ivanka Trump's clothing line and within 5 years landed a job as President Trump's White House communications director has reemerged 6 months after resigning that post. On Saturday, Hicks was spotted getting onto Air Force One just before it took off for the president's rally in Ohio. And there she is, actually in the plane with the president. But President Trump may want to get some legal advice before he swaps stories with Hope. Because about 2 months before she resigned, Hope Hicks met with Robert Mueller, reportedly more than once. Hope Hicks, you will remember, was also on board Air Force One when President Trump was putting together his public statement about the now infamous Trump Tower meeting. Ms. Hicks was reportedly right by the president's side for that project, texting back and forth with his son, Donald Trump Jr. Now, today, a source close to the Trump legal effort tells me that the president's conduct since the Trump Tower meeting, his involvement in the crafting of a false statement about that meeting, and conversations he's had with White House aides about it point to an increasing likelihood that the president could be vulnerable to charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. It also brings back into focus the ongoing legal jeopardy facing all of the individuals who have testified to Robert Mueller and his team about the crafting of the original false statement and any conversations they may have had with the president about their testimony. With this in mind, what do we think Hope Hicks and the president talked about? And do you think anybody wanted to download afterward? Joining me now to help me answer that question is Frank Figliuzzi, former assistant director for counterintelligence during Robert Mueller's tenure as FBI director, and back with us again, because we can never get enough of this man, is former U.S. Attorney Chuck Rosenberg. Let me start with you, Frank, because we started this conversation at 4, shortly after I heard this reporting from someone close to the Trump legal effort that the president, even if he ended up having nothing to do with the original meeting with the Russians, all of his conduct since then, all of his involvement in, we now know, dictating the false statement to the press, all of the conversations that have been widely reported by the New York Times that he's had with White House aides about their interactions with Mueller's investigators, that all of those incidents could leave him very vulnerable to charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice.
Yeah, we continue to see this unexplainable behavior, Nicole, between what is right from a legal strategic standpoint, which would be to not talk or be in the same room or airplane with Hope Hicks, and then the strategy perhaps of public perception, which is to tell the public, look, I'm thumbing my nose at all of this legalese and Bob Mueller. If I want to invite Hope Hicks on Air Force One, I'm going to do it. She's with me. She's on my team. The problem with this dichotomy between what you should do legally and what you should do for public perception is that he's going down the wrong path with this. So he's subjected himself to yet more questioning by Bob Mueller, if that ever happens. And he's putting Hope Hicks into a box where she's likely to be re-interviewed, perhaps for hours again, about what transpired on that airplane, whether the president or his aides are attempting to tamper with her and her testimony. It's all a very bad idea.
And Chuck Rosenberg, we know that lies were told, if we could just adopt some of the language that politicians sometimes take on in scandals like this. There was one in the White House in which I worked where Scooter Libby was ultimately charged with obstruction of justice and perjury, and that's often what trips up aides. And it was posited to me today that it's possible that somebody involved in crafting that false statement repeated that lie when they went in to meet with Robert Mueller. And it's possible that one of the people that was called in and questioned about that is already in some legal jeopardy, and that for the president to talk to anybody that was called in and questioned about that is not smart.
No, it's not smart. And Frank's exactly right. Look, if you're a defense attorney, the first thing you tell your client is don't talk to anybody who might be a witness in this case. And if you need to pass something to another person, another witness, do it through me, your lawyer. Right? We can talk lawyer to lawyer without obstructing justice or tampering with witnesses, but you cannot talk witness to witness. At the very least, it looks bad. More than that, Nicole, it could be actual witness tampering. Imagine the president saying, hey, what's your recollection of what happened on Air Force One? Or, how did you describe this to Bob Mueller? Did he ask you about it? And what else did he ask you? And so to the extent that Mr. Trump and his team are concerned that this is taking too long, My advice to them would be to stop creating more evidence.
And Frank, we already have some evidence. I mean, there was someone who was part of the PR side of this, Mark Corallo. He quit around this flashpoint of the crafting of a false statement. He quit over concerns that obstruction of justice was an area that they were all wading into. Do you think there's any chance that Hope Hicks was on board Air Force One as someone who's already a cooperating witness in the Mueller investigation?
Wow. I think it's a minimal chance, Nicole. I'm not sure the strategy would be to insert someone into Air Force One who is going to go up against the President of the United States, who is represented by counsel. Probably highly unlikely. So we've got a woman here who's got her whole career in life in front of her. Her judgment so far has been, as far as we know, has been rather poor, and she's got a choice to make. She can either establish a legacy of associating herself with a president who is likely to face serious charges, if not impeachment or otherwise, or she can be her own person and do the right thing. And we're not seeing that happen yet. In fact, we're seeing quite the opposite. And
cooperating witness, Chuck, includes everyone that's gone in and cooperated and answered questions from Special Counsel Robert Mueller and all of his investigators. So that, at this point, does include a pretty wide group of current and former White House aides. We know the White House counsel, Don McGahn, is technically a cooperating witness. Sean Spicer went in. Josh Rafael, the former spokesperson to Jared Kushner. I mean, there are a lot of people cooperating as witnesses in the Mueller probe. Where do you put their risk at this point to either being drawn in? We know that the president's now being investigated under this beefed up post-Enron witness tampering law, and we know that he continues to be a subject of obstruction of justice questions. Where do you think the interaction with all these witnesses ranks on a risk scale for the president?
Well, it makes it more risky for the witnesses. It makes it more risky for the president. But let me just draw a distinction between a cooperating witness, Nicole, and a truthful witness. I think Frank's point is a very important one, and I want to underscore it. I also agree that Hope Hicks is very unlikely, wired up or going in as a government agent, if you will, trying to elicit admissions from the president. That doesn't mean she's not a truthful witness. And the more the president talks to her, the more the government and the Mueller team is going to want to know what he said. All of these people you just described are very likely truthful witnesses, right? They don't want to risk their own, fortune, their own liberty, right, their own freedom to lie on behalf of another person. And so as the president continues to reach out, he's increasing his own risk. And as long as the people to whom he's reaching out tell the truth when they're questioned about it, they should be okay. Of course, like Mr. Gates and Mr. Manafort, if they've committed underlying crimes, they have a separate problem.
Just like Mike Flynn, too, right? Plenty of people around.
That's exactly right.
Frank Figliuzzi, former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence, Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. Attorney. Thank you both so much for spending some time with us. Still ahead tonight, Democrats are trying to pull off something that has not been done since the 1980s, and they may just do it. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.